Welcome back to Puddle of Porridge, where today we're going to be discussing not only our first warrior build, but our first weapons-based build. And we'll go into why this is a weapons-based and not a utility-based build later on. But I want to provide a little bit of background of why I want to focus on the particular build we're discussing in this video. You see, in most MMOs, you sit down to play a warrior, you're either playing as a tank or as melee DPS, and although that is an important role for a warrior in this game, it is not so much the role for someone starting off as a warrior in Guild Wars 2. See, the early game content isn't really built for that, so DPS is kind of king, and you're gonna be a little bit squishy, especially because your equipment might not be up to snuff, might not be the best as you're doing that 1 to 80 leveling experience. So today we are going to cover a build that covers a lot of the basics of being a warrior with some differences to the play style that is going to help with your survivability in the early and even the late game. So without further ado, let's talk about my beginner friendly ranged warrior build. Okay, so what is going to make this build different from our other builds so far is this is our first weapon skill based build, in that our whole build is going to be centered largely around, and our whole play style is going to be centered largely around our weapon skills, as opposed to the other builds where we were focused more on a certain set of utility skills and our weapons were more to enhance that. Now it's the other way around. We have our entire playstyle dedicated by our weapon, and our utility skills are there to enhance our weapon skills. So let's quickly go over the weapons that we're going to be using first, and then I'll go over the utility skills and then the traits, and then after all that is done, we'll go over a few varieties that we can kind of dance about and play with. The weapons we're going to use in this build are the longbow and the rifle, and simply put, it's because these two weapons are the ones that are available to core warrior. Now, they have different functionality and can basically be split into two categories here. The longbow is our Condi weapon, and the rifle is our power weapon. They both have excellent utility on their own, and we are gonna be using them both to certain degrees of effectiveness. We're going to try and get the most out of both of them. Obviously, this is a training wheels build. We are focused more on hybrid damage as opposed to Condi or power. But keep that in mind if you are wanting to shift into a more power focused build or a more Condi focused build for your end goal builds, at least. So let's go over the weapon skills for each weapon, and it'll kind of become clear where these weapons excel. Now, before we go any further, I just want to point out I've taken off all of the traits that have to do with buffing these weapons, so I can talk about them in their purest form before we discuss putting the traits on. So let's talk about longbow first, because it's already equipped. Our auto attack is just a very simple, we fire 2 shots at once, they do damage, nothing special. Our skill 2 is a nice solid damage attack that does burning damage. Now, the fun thing about Fan of Fire is that the closer you fire it, the more of a chance that 2 or even 3 arrows will hit your target. And if multiple arrows hit your target, you're going to be doing more damage per arrow. It's one that benefits from firing at close range, but you're still getting that little extra oomph from 3 stacks of burning if fired at long range. Next is our Arcing Arrow. Arcing Arrow also long range attack, does burning, and is a blast combo finisher, so that's handy for your friends in combat. Smoldering Arrow. Smoldering Arrow is a very, very good condition attack. It's a very, very good crowd control condition attack, at least, because we're firing an arrow that does blind, which is a soft CC, and does daze, which is a hard CC. So you'll kind of find liberal use of this attack is gonna really help break down those defiance bars. And finally, our least damaging attack, well, one of the least damaging attacks, is Pin Down. This is the one that you also want to use when you've got that big defiance bar. It dishes out Immobilize, and it does bleed. So we're not only getting another CC, but we are getting a nice stack of bleed on top of that. So if we look at this as a whole, we have 3 attacks that do damage over time conditions, and 2 attacks that are fairly significant crowd control abilities. Now, before we move over to Rifle, let's talk about the Burst skill. This is a skill that all warriors have with their weapons. Basically, we build up adrenaline, we build up this bar here. The higher the adrenaline, the more damage this ability will do. Now, Combustive Shot is very simple. Fire a big old arrow. It creates a combo field, a fire field specifically, and it does damage and burning. So we have a whole bunch of burning coming from this weapon, a little bit of bleed, and a huge amount of crowd control. Very handy weapon to have in our back pocket, especially when we're staying at range. It keeps us valuable in a group setting, so if we're playing with friends and we're trying to drop down those bosses, but it also means we're quite self-sufficient in that area as well. Let's have a little look at Rifle next. Now, Rifle works quite differently. Rifle is more about focusing down on a singular target with raw power damage. We look at our skill 1 here. We gain might if we attack vulnerable targets, as well as just being a very standard pew pew, we're going to shoot our gun weapon. It's very reliable. You can just auto attack till the cows come home, and if your target has vulnerability, we're going to gain stacks of might, which is very handy when we look at the other skills in this weapon. Our skill 2, very simple. Volley is we fire 5 shots in near quick succession. Same range as skill 1. Once again, very, very handy. There's not much to talk about with these first 2, other than the vulnerability on skill 1. This is just a slightly better version. Explosive Shell is where things get interesting. See, Explosive Shell dishes out vulnerability and cripple, so we have access to a soft CC, but we're dishing out vulnerability, which means that if we're auto attacking after it, we're getting might. Similarly, with Brutal Shot, if we hit with Brutal Shot, we're dishing out more vulnerability, which gives us more might with our auto attack. And more importantly, Brutal Shot's a very good utility ability as well, so I always like to keep one in your back pocket. It removes the Immobilize condition from us and applies it to our target. And once again, Immobilize is a very powerful crowd control ability. Not only that, but it's an evade attack, so you can avoid direct damage to your character. Lastly, we have Rifle Butt. Now, Rifle Butt is very interesting because it's our closest ranged attack. It's a very powerful CC because it's a knockback. So it can really break down those Defiance bars. But it also recovers ammunition to our rifle skills. Now, ammunition is this little number at the top right of the skill. These little numbers up here. You can see it down here on the actual bar as well. Down here. Now, the thing with an ammunition attack is if we fire off the attack, we can basically fire it off again very quickly till we've used both abilities of it. Then it must go into a proper recharge. I'll just demonstrate that very quickly with Explosive Shot. Fire off Explosive Shot and we can use it very quickly again. And if we look down here, we now need to wait for it to recharge before we can use it again. But our skill is now recharging. But once we have the two, we can fire it off basically one after the other. So this, if we can dive into combat a little bit and hit with this, it's not only handy to drop down those Defiance bars, but it keeps our other skills up and running as well. Lastly, we have our burst attack, which is Kill Shot. Kill Shot is a very, very powerful single target attack. Although it pierces, so you hit your target and it will go through them. This is basically just, I want to do a big chunk of damage all at once, and I want to do it now. So, whereas the bow had our combo field and a lot of burning, this is our single target burst damage attack. It's our big hit. Okay, so now that that's all cleared up, we'll talk about traits. Talking about traits, we have the Discipline trait line to start with. Mostly because this is going to be the backbone of the build, really. Now, we'll discuss the minor traits first because they are very synergetic and helpful. And that is Versatile Rage, Adrenaline on a weapon swap, and as we build Adrenaline, we can use our burst skill more often. Fast Hands lets us swap weapons more often, which means more burst skill. And finally, Versatile Power gives us might whenever we swap weapons and gives us a reduced recharge time so we can use burst skill more often. All of these work really well. These three traits, super duper handy. It's just, we are going to be swapping weapons a lot anyway to give us the most out of our two ranged weapons, so we may as well make the most of it with our traits. Now for the linchpin of this whole build is this little trait here, Crack Shot. Now Crack Shot buffs our auto attack, our skill 1, on both our bow and rifle. So look at rifle up here. It's now doing more damage than before we had this trait on. And if we swap over to bow, it now does burning damage, making our bow a true blue Condi weapon. So for a hybrid character, we now have a Condi weapon and a power weapon to kind of swap between and make the most out of our hybrid damage. Next up is our third trait line down here, not trait line, column in our trait line, and that is Burst Mastery. Burst Mastery is super useful because it not only means our burst attacks are doing more damage, but we're getting adrenaline back from their usage. So you can kind of see the pattern here. We want to up our ranged weapon, but also we want to keep those burst attacks coming. Now, keep in mind, you'll probably unlock this one towards the end of the discipline trait line. So, heightened focus is a nice earlier replacement. Although I don't use it mostly in the open world, I find you don't get the most out of it most of the time. It's very handy in structured content, not so much in the open world, because things are going to drop down too quickly for you to get the most out of your quickness as you apply quickness to yourself when you're attacking foes below 50%. And if you're fighting, say, a world boss, they're not going to go down as quick. So for half of the fight, you've got a big buff, and for the other half of the fight, not so much. Next up is our second trait line, and the reason why I talk about this one last is purely because I have double standards on, because I like to run this build with banners. You can see all the banners there, but we'll discuss that when we get to the skills section of this build. If you don't want to run banners, Brawler's Recovery is right here and just as helpful because it works in with our whole weapon swapping thing. We're swapping weapons a lot. We may as well have a little bit of Condi Cleanse in the background on weapon swap just as a treat. So let's look at strength next. Now, strength is a bit of a mixed bag. There's going to be stuff we're going to ignore and stuff we're going to make a whole lot of use out of. So if we look at restorative strength, this is more of a back burner thing. It's quite helpful to have on hand. We gain might whenever we use a healing ability. We're going to heal at some point. We may as well get might out of it. Next is Body Blow. Now, Body Blow, very, very handy. We have a lot of these CCs on our bar. We have access to knockbacks and dazes. So we've now turned these CC abilities into offensive abilities that dish out weakness and bleeding. So if we look up here at Smoldering Arrow, now when we fire Smoldering Arrow with Body Blow on and we successfully stun, it's now an offensive attack that's going to do a stack of bleed. Great. It's a net positive. It's going to be very rare that it's going to come into action, but it's going to be handy to have around. And lastly, on this trait line, we have Berserker's Power, which increases the strike damage of our burst skills based on our adrenaline level. So basically, we're going to get a little thing in the corner, and it's going to just make our burst attacks more powerful. That's it. The more adrenaline we have before we use our burst attack, the more powerful it's going to be. And that's on top of the already higher damage potential of some burst attacks that we have on hand. The minor traits for this build, Pinnacle of Strength down here, gives us more power and more a crit chance when we apply might to ourselves. It's more damage, it's free. Let's just keep that on the back burner. And finally, building momentum. Burst skills restore endurance because we want to use those burst skills a lot. We want to be moving a lot. We're going to be dodging a lot. So this kind of just works in with our whole build anyway. It's nice when the minor traits line up with what we want. Lastly, we have arms. Now, arms is gonna be a bit of a weird one, but it's still gonna be handy. So if we look down here, we have Furious Burst and our minor traits. Furious Burst gives us Fury when we weapon swap, so not only are we getting might, but we're getting Fury every time we swap our weapon. Next is Deep Strikes. We have increased Condi damage when we have Fury. Once again, more damage. This is going to be more for the bow side, but hey, it's more damage coming from our burning and bleeds. And we have a chance to inflict more bleeding whenever we crit, which we will probably do more often with the increased crit chance from Fury. So these minor ones also all nicely line up, they sync up well. We're going to get quite a lot out of them. Next is Opportunist. We gain more Fury and Adrenaline when we immobilize a foe. So when we drop those break bars down to 0 or hit a regular mob with one of our immobilizing abilities, we get a bit of Adrenaline and Fury. So super duper useful with our pin down. Next is Sundering Burst, and Sundering Burst is going to synergize well with our rifle because it's going to make our burst skills dish out vulnerability and inflict more vulnerability if our burst skills crit. So we're now doing more and more damage, especially in rifle. This is a great one with the kill shot burst skill. And lastly, we have Burst Precision, in which our burst skills have an increased crit chance. So if we look at this all together, our burst skills are going to be used more often, deal more damage, have a higher chance of crit, and inflict vulnerability, so our follow-up attacks are going to do more damage. And if we're in rifle, we are going to be buffing ourselves as well as doing DPS. So overall, you can kind of see where this build is going. That's before we even touch on our optional skills. So our utilities are weird for this build, in that we don't really have a set target for them. The reason why I recommend banners up here is because of double standard. It's already on this trait line, and banners tend to be quite useful for late game warrior content. So learning how to use them early on is very helpful. However, I do recognize that they're not the easiest ones to get to grips with, particularly if you're a new player. And they can be a little bit boring if you like a more active gameplay style. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of certain skills and skill types for this build. So we're going to start with banners, and then we're going to discuss our healing and elite skill. So if we look at banners, banners are very handy. I actually don't recommend Banner of Tactics all too often, largely because that stun break down there is a fake stun break. It's when the banner goes down, not when you use the skill. So it's really good for team play, but not very good if you get stunned because you can't break your own stun. I'd recommend taking a different one if you're using this as a stun break, but because you're going to be staying at a distance, you're probably not going to get stunned all too often. So it's a bit of a safer bet to take it on this build over other builds, but if you want to play it safe, swap that out. That would be the first one I'd swap out. But as for banners themselves, banners are typically aligned in a very specific way. A banner is a powerful boon well. It's not a well skill, but it is basically a point that you place down that is going to just pulse out boons. They sometimes have other effects, like with this one we have a stun break, this one delivers bleed and cripple, this one delivers daze, but the most important thing about them is you have a whole 15 seconds where your banner is going to pulse out your boon near constantly. There's a boon application interval on each one. So for this one, the banner of strength, it's every 3 seconds. So every 3 seconds, we're getting a pulse of 2 might. So that's super duper handy, and they have a fairly short cooldown time. 30 seconds isn't the shortest, but it's not the longest either. So they are a nice, reliable skill set to have. They help allies, they help you, but if you don't feel them, you don't like them, that's not the end of the world with this build. So let's go over some of the skill types that we can benefit from. So let's start with physical. Physical, we don't want with this build. Physical abilities are largely going to be close range with the exception of Bolas, but our skills can do what Bolas does. Okay? We don't need Bolas. Signets, always handy on a lot of builds. They basically provide a passive buff, and if we wish to activate them, they'll provide us with a bonus. The problem is they vary wildly in recharge time. So if we look at Signet of Might here, that's 20 seconds. But if we go over here to Dolyak's Signet, which is the stun break, we're looking at a big hefty 40 seconds. It might be worth peppering 1 or 2 onto your skill bar if you want to say boost your crit or boost your power damage. Shouts are one that I can always recommend if you want that more active feel over banners. So if you want to swap down to Brawler's Recovery and fill your trait line, your skill line, sorry, full of shouts instead, you're probably going to see a very similar gameplay style with the banners, but you're going to feel more active doing it. So if we look at, say, Shake It Off, we have a big old Condi cleanse coming from that one. We have For Great Justice, which delivers some offensive boons, which is going to help us out in combat. And we have On My Mark, which is a big vulnerability stack onto your target, which obviously, if you were paying attention earlier, is going to help with our skill 1, Fierce Shot on Rifle. So shouts are a good secondary option. However, shouts can be spammed briefly. But if we look up here, it's got ammunition, so if we run out of our ammo, we got to wait for that slightly longer recharge time. Okay, if it says it on the skill description. So for Shake It Off, for instance, we're looking at a 25-second cooldown time, which, once again, isn't bad. It's less than 30 seconds. If you are not feeling the banners, I do recommend shouts, but that's not all that the warrior has to offer. We also have stances. Now, stances work a little bit differently. Stances are instant use buffs, basically. And the advantage of stances is that a lot of them are stun breaks. So we have 3 of them down here. 3 of them are stun breaks. 1 of them isn't. They have typically longer cooldown times, but they are very powerful on warrior. So if we look at, say, this one here as our stun break, we are breaking our stun, we're giving ourselves offensive buffs, and we're dishing out a bunch of, so we can dish out a bunch more damage. But if we move down the line here, we have Endure Pain, which, although also a stun break, is very powerful. We don't take any damage for a while, but it's on a 60-second cooldown time, which is so long. So it's really a case of, if you want to use other things other than a banner, which is slow but reliable, you can experiment with different skills here and really get the benefit out of it. So I'm going to just mock up a couple of utility skills here. So let's throw in a frenzy. We have a 4 Great Justice up here. Let's maybe throw in, I don't know, let's mock in our Signet of Might as well. So we have a varied skill bar here. We have a Shout, we have a Stance, and we have a Signet of Might. This can work just as well if you want to have that more active gameplay style that isn't reliant on banners. You can mix and match. We're not reliant on reduced cooldown times with our trait line. Which brings us to the healing and elite skill that I've chosen here. So the elite skill I chose was because of the banner. If you're not using the banner, I'd actually recommend using Signet of Rage, and I'd recommend swapping into Signet of Rage if you have access to it whenever you're not in a group-based scenario, because Signet of Rage will give us passive adrenaline generation in combat. We never want to actually activate this. That's what we use a banner for. Signet of Rage is going to make sure that we use our kill shot more often. So if we're not playing around other people, or not just the kill shot, but combustive shot as well. So if we're not playing around other people, Signet of Rage is the way to go. Healing wise, I'd either recommend using Mending if you don't have a whole lot of Condi Cleanse. So if you're struggling with Brawler's Recovery or are using banners, Mending's a really good one to have in place here. Removes 5 conditions and has a decent heal and has a short cooldown time. If you are, say, using Shake It Off, you might not be as reliant on that condition removal. So we'll want to swap it out for, say, To the Limit, which gives us adrenaline once again, allows us to use our burst skill more often, and is a powerful heal as well. So alternating to different skills with this build and learning which utility skills is best for you is kind of one of the key points of this build, because all of the heavy lifting is done by these and that. So it's really up to you to figure out what's the most comfy for you with your utility skills. I will recommend what I think is best or most useful or most helpful in setting you up for your future as a warrior, but I can't recommend what you're most comfortable playing as. And I'll show you what I mean by that in the demo. Now normally, if you've seen my other videos, this is where the demo goes. Not today. I've decided from now on I'm going to split them. This has been a last minute decision, which is why in this video you are going to see me talking about the demo coming up. Well, it's coming up, but it's going to be the next video I upload instead of just being at the end of this one. So if you've enjoyed this one, if you found the theory section the important bit, then feel free to just click off here. If you want to stick around for the next one, which I highly recommend you do, it's a little bit extra information, it's a little bit more informative, and it genuinely does show you how this build functions, how we are going to work it out in the open world, playing the game. Then definitely check that out. So hopefully I'll see you there, and if not, have an absolutely beautiful day.